Hi, this is the extended video response to Phillip DeFranco's videos on Gaza. You can see the shorter version here. Shout out to Aliza for all her help. I know that many of you are confused about the same things that Phil is confused about, so I'm just going to clear something up before I get to Operation Pillar of Defense, which was the most recent Israeli operation in Gaza. Though you point out that Palestinians and their supporters tend to cite the quote-unquote illegal Israeli expansion into Palestinian land. That's actually one of the biggest myths related to the conflict, and now I'll just give you some background to help you understand why. 2,000 years ago, the Romans took over the formerly independent Jewish kingdom of Judea. They renamed it Palestine in 135 CE. For the next 2,000 years, Palestine was ruled by a series of outside rulers and was home to a shifting population. Two things remain the same. Palestine was a region, not a state, which has enormous ramifications with regard to international law and who has the right to sovereignty in that land. Jews continued to live in Palestine throughout the centuries. In fact, until 1948, both Jews and Arabs living in Palestine were referred to as Palestinian. It was only 1948, when Israel was created and both Jews and Arabs within Israel came to be referred to as Israeli, that the term Palestinian came to refer solely to the Arabs of the region. Today, some Arabs in Israel consider themselves Palestinian, while others consider themselves only Israeli. Now, it's true that many European Jews immigrated to Israel in the first half of the 20th century. However, according to this Hamas official, many of today's Palestinians are actually originally from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, as opposed to from what is today Israel or Gaza. With regard to Gaza, contrary to popular belief, Jews have a very long history in Gaza. In modern times, they were kicked out by Napoleon and returned, they were kicked out by the Ottomans and returned, and they were kicked out by the British following violent Arab riots and returned. In 1948, the Jews were kicked out again when Egypt illegally invaded Gaza. Egypt occupied Gaza for the next 19 years. No Palestinian state was set up during that time, though nothing was preventing it, and certainly not Israel. In 1967, Egypt made a series of moves that were tantamount to a declaration of war. In May 1967, Egypt's president stated, and I'll quote, "Taking over Sharm el-Sheikh in confrontation with Israel, and it also meant that we were ready to enter a general war with Israel. The battle will be a general one, and our basic objective will be to destroy Israel." In the ensuing war, Israel took Gaza. Again, contrary to popular belief, this wasn't an occupation. You can see the link below to understand why. In 1970, Israel began to rebuild Gaza's Jewish communities. You can get an idea of what those communities were like here. In 2000, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat rejected Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak's offer for peace, and the Palestinians launched their second intifada, infamous for its suicide bombings. In 2001, Palestinian terrorists from Gaza launched their first rocket at Israel. By 2005, Israel had enough of the violence and took a gamble for peace. Israel would give Gaza to the Palestinians, and if peace followed, the land for peace model would be vindicated. So Israel dismantled the settlements, forcibly evacuating thousands of Jews from their homes. It was extraordinarily difficult for the Israeli public, but it was done for the sake of peace. By September 12, 2005, every Israeli soldier and citizen was gone from Gaza, and the disengagement was complete. On the same day, Palestinian terrorists from Gaza launched 2 rockets into Israel, and launched tens more in the months that followed. So what are the reasons for the rockets? Palestinians and their supporters would have you believe that the rockets were in response to the occupation and or the blockade. Now, leaving aside the term occupation, Israel had left Gaza, and there was no blockade in place at the time that the first post-disengagement rockets were launched into Israel in 2005. It was only in 2006, when Hamas won Palestinian elections, that Israel and the Middle East Quartet, the EU, the US, the UN, and Russia, chose to place sanctions against the Hamas government until it would recognize Israel, renounce violence, and accept previous agreements between previous Palestinian governments and Israel. Hamas refused. Then in 2007, Hamas ousted its Palestinian rival Fatah from Gaza, and sanctions were dropped against the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority. At the same time, a blockade was instituted against Hamas. The purpose of the blockade is to limit the amount of weapons Hamas has access to because of its attacks against Israeli civilians, not the other way around. So if it's not the occupation and it's not the blockade, why do Palestinian terrorists launch rockets against Israel? This is going to sound crazy, because it is. But Palestinian terrorists really do want to wipe Israel off the map and kill all the Jews. Let me read you something from Hamas's charter. Israel will exist, and will continue to exist, until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jews will hide behind the stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him." Now, I'm aware that Hamas has said that it would accept a state on 1967 borders, which are technically 1949 armistice lines. However, even if Hamas would accept a state along 1949 armistice lines, that doesn't mean that it would accept Israel along those lines. For example, in an interview with CNN on November 21, 2012, a Hamas leader stated, "I accept the state of the 1967. How can I accept Israel? They have occupied my land. I need recognition, not the Israelis." And of course, we discussed about Palestinian land earlier. Basically, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority for that matter, see the creation of a Palestinian state along 67 borders as a stepping stone to a Palestinian state that will replace Israel. I'll place a link in the description with further information. Now, to Operation Pillar of Defense. In the last 11 years, Palestinian terrorists launched 13,000 rockets at Israeli civilians. Palestinians and their supporters like to refer to these rockets as harmless firecrackers. You can take a look at these links and let me know whether you would be okay with such harmless firecrackers hitting your hometown. In October, terrorists launched between 150 and 200 rockets into Israel. On November 10th, terrorists launched an anti-tank missile at an Israeli jeep patrolling the Israel-Gaza border, wounding 4 soldiers. Israel responded by attacking military targets in Gaza, and terrorists in Gaza launched 30 rockets at Israeli civilians. Over the next 2 days, terrorists from Gaza launched 111 rockets at Israel. By November 13th, Israel had decided that it needed to take action to make its southern cities livable again. Hence the killing of Jabari, a top terrorist responsible for many attacks against Israeli civilians. I should mention that not all rockets are launched by Hamas. There are many terrorist organizations in Gaza vying for power. But just as the US would be responsible for any attacks launched from its territory into Canada, Hamas was responsible for any attacks launched from Gaza into Israel. And that's why Israel holds Hamas responsible for any attacks coming out of its territory. And just to address the imbalance in civilian casualties, I hear a lot of attempts at moral equivalency between Israel and terrorist organizations in Gaza. And let me be clear, there is no moral equivalency between Hamas and other terrorist organizations in Gaza and Israel. Israel tries to protect its own civilians, and it tries to protect enemy civilians. Whereas terrorists in Gaza try to attack enemy civilians, while putting their own civilians in severe danger, never mind the intentional attacks against their own people. With regard to Israeli casualties, the reason more Israeli civilians haven't been hurt or killed is largely due to miracles. Rockets have hit kindergartens, universities, cars, homes, and other civilian targets. Also, Israel has this super cool defense system called the Iron Dome, which basically explodes rockets in the air before they can hit densely populated Israeli cities. If not for the Iron Dome, the Israeli death toll would have been far higher. As for civilians in Gaza, first, it's important for you to be aware that many of the photos and footage coming out of Gaza and published in the mainstream media are phony. Many were taken months ago, and in Syria, and one even showed Israeli victims of a Palestinian suicide bombing in Israel. And second, some civilians in Gaza were actually killed by terrorists in Gaza who were launching rockets from too close to civilian areas. I'll provide you with more information in the links below. Furthermore, Palestinian terrorists intentionally attack from among civilians. This is both to deter Israeli strikes, because the terrorists are aware that Israel will try to avoid harming civilians, and so that the terrorists can complain when the civilians are hurt or killed. The responsibility for these injuries and deaths lies solely with the terrorists. Israel does its best to avoid striking when no civilians are present, as you can see from this clip, but that intelligence isn't always available. Israel did such a remarkable job protecting civilians during Operation Pillar of Defense that the New York Times published an article by the AP that stated, Israel, armed with precise intelligence and newly developed munitions, has carried out hundreds of surgical strikes in a campaign meant to hit militants hard while avoiding the civilian casualties that have marred previous offensives. In 4 days of fighting, Israel has sought to hit clear militant targets, relying on painstaking intelligence gathered through a network of informers, aerial surveillance, and other high-tech measures. An arsenal of high-flying drones constantly hovering above Gaza provides a live picture of movements on the ground. Other technological means used to avoid collateral damage include specially designed munitions with smaller blowback, a system of sending text messages and automated phone calls to warn residents to vacate areas ahead of strikes, and stun explosives that are deployed to create large explosive sounds to scare off civilians before the real payload is deployed against militants. I should note that neither the New York Times nor the AP is generally considered sympathetic towards Israel. Also, Phil mentioned that the last time you can remember leaflets being dropped was when the US nuked Japan. In fact, Israel did so at least once before as part of Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009. There might be some sort of psychological warfare aspect to it, but its key purpose is to protect civilian life. And lastly, civilian casualty rate to combatant casualty rate was actually incredibly low during this operation when compared to the casualty rates of other conflicts around the world. And just to note for yourselves, I'd actually looked into the numbers that the Palestinian Center for Human Rights put out following Operation Cast Lead, and they included no terrorists in their list of civilian casualties. That's just something you might want to take into account when you're considering who to believe with regard to numbers. I'll just leave you with this last thought. I spoke about the numbers so that you could have the facts. But the truth is, when you're trying to decide who's right and who's wrong in a conflict, the numbers are close to irrelevant. The fact that more people were killed on one side doesn't make that side right. And the fact that both sides have caused death doesn't make both sides wrong. There are many other factors to consider, such as those described in this video. There's more to talk about, but I'll leave it at that. I'm open to discussion and questions. My contact information will be in the description below. Thanks so much for watching.